Hi guys! So for my presentation, I have the opportunity to speak with my aunt, who I'm going to call Judy, to protect her identity. And I chose to focus on integrity versus despair. So Erickson's the last stage of development, which occurs in older adulthood, and focuses on, the crisis of the acceptance of death. So either, the favorable outcome in which people would be okay with their mortality, or, the crisis in which they obviously wouldn't be. For my aunt, this crisis was incredibly prevalent in her life due to a kidney diagnosis at the age of 16. Being faced with one's mortality at such a young age, even though she wasn't necessarily considered an older adult, she wasn't in that age range that Erickson would have considered for this particular stage. She was absolutely going through that crisis of looking at her life and what her accomplishments were, and looking at her own mortality, and either accepting her death or falling into crisis. She was okay with it at the age of 16. She fell into the favorable outcome only because she was fortunate enough to have a good doctor that told her, I will worry about this, and I will tell you when to worry. And she just kind of flew off of that mentality. She accepted that support, and she went with it and continued to live to the fullest. At the age of 32, that kidney failed and she needed a transplant, and she was once again faced with this particular crisis. Again, not in that age range that Erickson would have considered, but still really going through that crisis of, I'm probably going to die. Fortunately, her sister was able to donate a kidney to her, and everything came out okay. That kidney did eventually fail, and she was forced to go on dialysis treatments and the transplant list, for the cadaver transplant list, waiting for a second kidney. And again, she was fortunate enough to get a second kidney at the age of 64, and it did not reject. So all of these factors contributed to this particular stage for her that she had been going through from the age of 16 rather than 65. Even though she technically is in that age range and that stage that Erickson would have considered, she was still going through this her entire life. One of the biggest challenges in regards to this crisis for her was her life on dialysis. She talked a lot about how dialysis affected her. It's very physically exhausting. It's painful. It's very, very draining on you, physically and emotionally. She talked a lot about what it meant to actually sit and wait on the transplant list, and the realization, that she might never get a kidney, and she might pass away, and or if she did get a kidney, it meant that somebody else had to die in order for her to live, and that is a very difficult concept for anybody at any age to kind of wrap their head around. And I looked at a lot of studies, this one in particular, that from Ingla and Ogden, in which they looked at people who were on the transplant list and who had suffered trauma, and particularly for people who were waiting for an organ. That transplant list, the longer that they had to wait, and the average wait for the United States, at least for a kidney, is 1 to 6 years. The less hope that they have, the less optimism that they have, and the more that they would fall into the crisis that Erickson is talking about, because they're not fulfilling their life. They're stuck revolving their life around these treatments. They are stuck with that mentality that, any day could be their last, and you can't be physically active, you can't plan vacations, you can't look forward to the future because it's not a guaranteed thing, and because your quality of life is so low. A huge accomplishment with that, though, was the stand up without rejection. Her first kidney lasted 32 years. This particular kidney, she's now on her second year, and a lot of that she contributes to living the best life possible. So, you're given this gift of an organ and a second chance at life, and you have to make sure that you live it to the fullest, both for yourself and for that person. So that mentality in and of itself kind of pulls one out of crisis and helps resolve that and make one okay with, being able to pass on because you're now living life to the fullest. Another challenge that she overcame was when she was 60, there was the unexpected death of her spouse, which was her support system financially, physically, and emotionally. It was a big blow to her. She started to isolate herself, because she was so depressed. She didn't want to, be around her family or her friends or to, put her problems on anybody else. And a lot of studies, this one in particular from New Orleans Minute, looked at, older adults who isolated and felt lonely and the negative factors that would have on them and, how they would view their life and mortality. And it was always in a negative way, but they also looked at, the context of it, in which, some older adults prefer to be alone. And it's more of a positive factor for them in resolving this crisis. A huge accomplishment for her was after, the recovery of her second transplant, she was asked to be an advocate and a coach to share her story with, future people who were going to be going through the same process that she went through, who maybe were on dialysis and waiting for a kidney. And for her, that was major in feeling accomplished in life and giving back to her community, and it plays into that nativity that is the stage before isolation versus despair, in which she's adding to the success of her community in the future. And for her, that was so fulfilling that it kind of lifted her out of that crisis. So again, the psychosocial crisis resolution, it's all about that final stage in life, which everybody goes through. It's about that death. So either, you're going to go to the favorable outcome and you're going to look back on your life and feel accomplished, feel a sense of peace and finality. You did what you needed to do. So you are okay. You are fine, ready to accept that last stage. And or you're going to fall into crisis, as Erickson would say, and there'd be a lot of fear and anxiety and regret looking back on your life, and you're not ready to pass on. So this whole resolution, there's not, depending on where somebody is in their older adulthood and life stage and their own biopsychosocial factors, there might not be a lot of time for resolution. My aunt was unique in that she was faced with this her whole life, but some people might be faced with their mortality only for a day. But in this older adulthood, this is where they start to think about, the legacy that they're leaving behind and coming to peace with that death. Some of the factors in this crisis resolution, so challenges and support. So a challenge, obviously, was the kidney failure. It was present most of her life, not just in old age. So, she kind of had to go through this crisis day to day, almost, because every day might be her last. Instead of, when you're older, you start to think about what you're leaving behind and the fact that, you are faced with your own mortality versus if you're diagnosed with something such as kidney failure at such a young age, that's present from that point forward. It actually, as a support, it was a changed perspective for her. So a lot of people looked at her and said, how unlucky you are that you had such a life where, you had not one but 2 kidney transplants, that's such a horrible life to live. Her mentality of it was that she was very lucky that, she had this diagnosis, but she got not one but 2 opportunities at a second life. And that she was able to overcome it, and the circumstances surrounding it, like, she beat a lot of the odds that go along with renal failure and kidney disease. So that's kind of common for people who go through trauma and stuff like this. So this Inman and Oakley looked at people who suffer trauma and interviewed them extensively, and they found that they go through a recalibration when they're faced with death, and that they're able to accomplish positive growth in their life and establish hope and optimism because they have lower expectations. There's less stress and importance on these big things such as money or, being a big time business corporate, whatever the major goals that we typically look at in life. You look at life on a more smaller scale. So being able to spend time with your family, being able to, walk 2 miles, those are huge accomplishments to someone, in which case their expectations are much lower and they're able to get more out of life. Another factor is the socioeconomic status. Judy was fortunate that she was able to be in the middle class. So she had the financial and economic resources. She had really good health care available to her versus somebody who's in the lower socioeconomic class wouldn't have had those resources. A study that I looked at, saw that people who were from the lower socioeconomic class, they lack those community resources, and as a result, they lack the psychological resources, such as, hope and optimism to help pull them out of crisis and get them into a better place. Another resource that she had that was huge and playing a factor was religion. So she felt that there was a bigger force at play here, that her life was played out for her, and it was out of her control. She felt that she was destined for these things, and she had a lot of support through the church and the community and her spirituality, and feeling that no matter when she went, she was going to a better place. Oppression was a huge influence in this as far as the length of wait for dialysis. While Judy herself may not have been oppressed, she was a white female from the middle class socioeconomic standpoint. When you're on the cadaver list, all of that is kind of taken away. And a lot of the organs that are available, they come from, unfortunately, including hers, like drug addicts or car accidents. But in this day and age, now that they have a cure for hepatitis C, a lot of the organs are coming from people who have unfortunately overdosed, kind of like hers. And that oppression for the lower socioeconomic area that we come from, like she may not have been in that status, but a lot of other people are, which leads to higher use of drug usage and, unfortunately, overdoses. And that plays a part in which, you get that kidney and you wonder what that person lived before you and how you want to honor them in getting that organ and moving forward in your recovery. Another factor that kind of played a part with her is she had a very dysfunctional family growing up and not a very good life with her mother. When she was first diagnosed, she asked her mom, why me? And her mom's response was, well, why not you? So that kind of changed her mentality of things and her entire outlook on it. Again, social programs, if we're looking at the big picture, she had access to Medicaid as an older adult, which helped her to pay for the treatments that she needed. She had a lot of support in the church community from her religious aspects, and a lot of support in the community itself. She was involved with biking, involved with the transplant community, because when you suffer from a transplant, you're surrounded by other people on dialysis, or other people who are waiting for organs, and being an advocate, she's very influenced and involved in that community where they are big supports to one another. Not just the patients, but the doctors and the nurses as well. They kind of become like their own separate family and friends, which was a huge contributing factor to her success and her recovery.